The notion of feedback is one of the most widely used and regularly deployed strategies in the toolkit of educators. And rightfully so, because much of the research points to the fact that it can be extremely powerful at improving learning. Yet did you know that major reviews of the scholarly literature on feedback suggest that up to 1/3 of all approaches to feedback can actually harm rather than help learning? And not all feedback is equal. Some forms of feedback have a much deeper and longer-lasting impact compared to others. In today's episode, we'll be discussing the topic of feedback with my guest and friend, Dr. Luke Mandouit, who lives and breathes effective education and all things to do with feedback. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the Powerful Learning Podcast. G'day and welcome to the Powerful Learning Podcast, where our mission is to help you know more, do more, and be more by delving into the science of effective learning and teaching. My name's Luke Rowe, and I'm a university lecturer and researcher who specialises in evidence-based teaching and the science of learning. The topic of feedback has become so ubiquitous in discussions among educators that it seems to have almost lost its charm. For many educators, the prospect of an hour-long podcast about feedback could very well send their eyes glazing over with boredom. Well, if that's you, I'm here to stoke the fires of your curiosity again. I want to challenge you by pushing the boundaries of everything you've ever known about the topic of feedback. I want to shift your thinking away from the mechanical or overly simplistic notion of feedback to one that's nuanced, complex, difficult, and messy. And if you're feeling delightfully confused by the time we're done, then I guess I've done my job. But this is too tall a task to do on my own. So I've recruited the help of my friend and educational expert, Dr. Luke Mandouit. Luke's not your typical academic. No. He's an applied researcher and practitioner. He's a school leader, and he's an educational innovation expert who currently works in schools and regularly grapples with the challenges faced by everyday educators who also seek to apply the latest and best research in their teaching context. We'll hear from Luke about the topic of feedback as a dynamic, multi-channel and continuous process that has the potential to transform the way we teach. I really hope you enjoy this discussion, and don't forget to subscribe if you'd like to hear more powerful learning podcasts in the future. And please leave a review so that others can discover our podcast and join us on a learning adventure. So without further ado, I bring you my discussion with Dr. Luke Mandouit. Luke Mandouit, good to see you, my friend. It's been a while.
It has been a while, indeed.
You've been out in the wild, in the real world. I've had the luxury of staying in the academic bubble while you've been rolling your sleeves up.
Yeah, I've been out of it for about
in the
3
trenches
years now. About 3 years now since I left Melbourne Graduate School of Education. Yes,
it's aged you quite well. You don't look like you're more than 5 years older than when I last saw you. So
thankfully it's a podcast, so it's audio only.
Yeah, good. I assure the audience that he's looking great. All right, so we're going to discuss a whole lot of topics today. And I think one of the things I'm really excited about is that you're an applied theoretician. So those things aren't an oxymoron. You can actually put theory into practice, unlike a lot of us who struggle with that concept of applying research into practice. And you're dealing with these challenges every day. So I think you're uniquely placed to shed some light on the challenges that those of us who are seeking to apply research to practice seek to remedy and overcome. One of the things, though, that I tend to do with my guests before we dive into all those difficult and tricky topics, to just get a sense of who you are and what attracted you to the educational profession and your current role. So if you could give us a bit of a background of yourself, that'd be great.
Okay, thanks, Luke. So I predominantly became a teacher, went straight into university and did my teaching degree straight from high school. And it really was just out of wanting to make a difference. I didn't really connect with the school that I went to as a student, but I had some really good teachers and they made a difference to me as a young person, and I wanted to do the same. And I went through a process of teaching and then went into school leadership. And at some point that journey intersected with the research space.
So in terms of going back to your own experience as a student, so it wasn't necessarily overall that you had a great experience in your schooling, but it was some specific teachers that inspired you to this profession. Would that be correct in saying that?
Obviously there's variance in the teachers that you have in school, and there's the ones that you have a good relationship with and they listen and they respond to students' needs. And I guess I experienced what it was like to have teachers who did listen and respond. And in contrast to that, some that didn't as much, I guess. So,
yeah.
And having an advocate as a young person is a really powerful thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's funny, the tables have turned. Now you're a teacher on the other side of that equation. I'm sure you can make a difference to those students as well. So let's fast forward a little bit into your current career situation. So give me a bird's eye view of what you're up to these days.
Yeah. So like I said, at some point, my leadership journey evolved or morphed into this hybrid research space. And that was initially through my master's research. That was the Master of School Leadership through the Department of Education in Bastow. And in that, I wanted to investigate student voice, giving students a voice. And that was in regards to using student feedback to enhance professional learning. So essentially, teachers and students engaging in dialogue around what the students needed, and the teachers setting some professional learning goals over the course of 12 months based on the needs that have emerged through those conversations. Following that, and that really got me thinking about impact. Hattie's Visible Learning had come out around that time. And I was really interested in the power of feedback and the influence of feedback on learning. But as a practitioner, I was struggling to join the dots between what I was reading in these academic papers and what it looked like on the ground. So one of the big ones was, for example, not delivering praise with feedback. And I would not do that. So I would, leave out the praise, and then I would see the impact it had on students. So that informed my doctoral research, which was in regards to continuing the theme of student voice, using student voice to develop a deeper understanding about how students receive, interpret, and action teacher feedback. And that was, a 6 or 7 year journey at the University of Melbourne with good people like yourself, Luke, under
great people.
under John Hattie's supervision. And in that, some really rich work in the science of learning with the Science of Learning team, primarily in partnership with University of Queensland and the Melbourne Graduate School of Education.
Yeah.
And that led me into, leading some of that work as director of the Science of Learning Network. And really the purpose of that network was to connect researchers and practitioners in a really authentic way and dialogue in regards to how research can inform practice and how researchers and teachers can work together and find common ground.
So that snowballed into you taking a bit of a detour into principalship, school leadership, and then back into a role that is almost like a school-based version of that Science of Learning Research Centre program, where you're still looking at the nexus of research and practice and how that can be meaningfully and authentically applied. But this is formalised across your school. You must feel like a pig in mud, enjoying yourself. That's your passions combined.
Yeah, it's a nice middle point. So my current role at St Michael's Grammar School is in regards to leading research, innovation and professional practice. And it really is that midpoint about how research and evidence can inform our innovation and professional practice, how we can develop research literacy in our teachers and our staff. And for me, how do I develop that literacy? How do I provide access to the best research? And perhaps, cutting out some of the noise. So
it's not just what you do, it's what you do not do that counts.
Yeah. And connecting research to practice. So a really good example is, I was thinking about how to explain it, but a really good example is at the start of the year, we implemented our teaching, learning and caring framework, in which we, often schools will have a teaching and learning policy and they'll have a wellbeing policy and they sit next to each other. But this framework recognises the importance of wellbeing within the classroom and deeply connects it to learning.
That's wonderful.
And within this framework, there's so many, it's evidence-based and there are so many rich connections but if we want teachers really deeply engaging with the elements that are in the framework, they also need access and advice as to what that implementation looks like. So in supporting that, upskilling staff and providing them access to the evidence that informs each of those elements.
Those elements, the interconnection of them is kind of like the sweet spot of education, right? So learning, teaching and well-being. And I was having this conversation with Associate Professor John Quash, who you know as well, one of our old colleagues at the University of Melbourne, and he's working a lot on wellbeing projects. And one of the things that really struck me in that conversation was how we cannot separate wellbeing from teaching and learning. We have to have teachers who have their health and well-being intact to be effective in the classroom. We have to have students who want to be in the classroom. And that's kind of like the gateway to learning. They're not going to want to learn if they don't even want to be there in the first place. So, I love that your school's kind of grappling at the interface of those three things. It's a really sophisticated framework. And too often in the past, we've tried to make education and teaching a one-trick pony profession and just say it's all about just academic, learning. And you've said very eloquently that it's about well-being as well.
I think especially in a post-COVID world, the development, I think about, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, but really I think about how do I want the learners under my care and my supervision leaving? It's not just about literacy and numeracy. It's about, are they going to be happy? Can they deal with challenge? Do they have resilience?
Yeah, those 3 R's are a reductionist perspective on education. I think it's been out of date for a while, the reading, writing, and arithmetic. It's definitely expanded. And I think what I hope we can get stuck into later is there's certainly an upside to that. And I think a lot of people will see that on face value. But the downside is that there's more for teachers to know. They've got to upskill themselves and expand the role that they inhabit in that classroom. So, that grappling with how to do that and how best to do that, I think is wonderful that we've got the opportunity to discuss that. So let's fast forward to this idea of feedback in the wild. And the reason I've called it this topic, feedback in the wild, is because what you're reading in the literature can differ so vastly from what's happening in the wild, in the classroom, in educational applied settings. And that example of the praise-based feedback approach being almost like a mechanical strategy to avoid some kind of self-concept harms. These types of research pieces tend to get a life of their own, and they can find momentum disproportionately to what the evidence actually says about those things. So let's talk about, first of all, just to get a good understanding for the listeners about what your perspective on feedback is, and we can kind of unpack, how you apply that in a classroom context. So speak to this idea of what feedback is from your perspective.
Yes. So obviously I recognise that feedback is a key driver of learning. And I really do think it is a powerful leverage point for learning. We'll talk a little bit about, some of the gaps in a moment, but it is a key driver of learning. It's well established within the literature. I recognise that it is multi-channeled. So traditionally, feedback is often conceptualised as, teacher to student.
One-way street.
But I recognise the power of the multi-channel element of feedback in it being teacher. It can be collaborative with students and their peers. And I also recognise the students' ability to self-regulate, self-correct, self-reflect as an internal voice as well. So I see it as teacher, peer and self. I view feedback through a social constructivist lens. 100 years ago, theorists looked at it more of through a behaviourist type lens, where it was something that was, done to the student or to the learner, almost like
stimulus response theories.
Yeah, like they were being
I shake a bell and you're going to start salivating, aren't you?
Yes. But, recognising that learners are all different and they bring their own lens. That social constructivist element. And I also recognise that feedback is constant. So it doesn't just come when you give the student a piece of work. It doesn't just come when you direct them informally. Feedback is a constant stream of information between teachers, between peer and student, and their own internal thoughts.
That is very it's a countervailing view, that one, because I think a lot of people, you spoke to this idea of feedback being a one-way street in a lot of these simplistic understandings of feedback. And when you ask the average student, what does feedback mean to you? They'll often think about it in the classroom context as, that's when the teacher tells me how well I did on the test. That's when they give me a score or a number or a comment or some kind of verbal feedback after a presentation. They wouldn't necessarily have this holistic perspective, this dynamic, changing, multi-channel, multi-pronged perspective that you have. So that's a very sophisticated deviation from the simplistic, one-way street transmission model of feedback of the past. One of the things you reminded me of was this Black and William paper, 2009, opening the black box of, I think it was student assessment. And they talk about those three dimensions of self-feedback, peer-to-peer feedback, and then the feedback loop between student and teacher. But I was sharing this with some of my students, my teacher candidates, and they brought to my attention that there's actually another form of feedback, which I thought was really interesting. I'll run this past you to see what you think, where you can actually grab feedback, not even in real time. You can get it before your students even arrive in your classroom by looking up their previous work. And so you can actually hit the ground running before you've ever even met these students, by getting a really strong and rich understanding of who they were prior to entering your classroom. So there's this really complex sort of links in the chain of feedback and information you can get to enrich your teaching experience. What's your perspective on that?
Well, yes, I think, and that's the power of formative assessment and having data in which you consider what your students know and what they're ready to know next. Yeah, so
do you put much stock on their prior learning though? Do you think that's a good source of feedback, or do you think that sometimes can bias our perspectives?
Well, I mean, and I think this comes down to the notion of evidence more broadly. It's really about understanding your context, but everything needs a starting point. And for lack of having a better place to start, evidence and research are our best starting point, as long as it's not fixed and we evolve as new information emerges. I don't see a problem with it. Simon Breakspear, when he talks about learning sprints, talks about using evidence as our best bet.
Yeah.
So not so much saying that it is the answer, but as a starting point, it's kind of the starting answer. And then we use that as a starting point, and then we adapt and we shift and our thinking evolves. We might go to other strategies and other interventions, but we've got to start somewhere.
Yeah.
And evidence points to the best bet.
Yeah. You're saying it's not, why start with a blank slate when you would be ignoring a whole lot of information that is potentially at your disposal that you can use to make a better estimate as to where the next best steps in the classroom are.
And I think added to that, I mean, let's just say I have a student in my class and there's a level of disengagement there and the data suggests it, and I know that they're disengaged because I know what they're capable of. I'm not going in there labeling them as disengaged and giving up. I really want to respond by, well, how do I engage them? Having this evidence, know what they're capable of. How do I switch to turn things around?
Right. So it's diagnostic in that sense. Like if we're talking about it in an assessment jargon, it would be like a diagnostic assessment allows you to get off on the right foot, to differentiate your instruction according to where the student's needs are at that given time. So it's very, really interesting. Let's kind of swing this back into the applied aspect of feedback. So we've now got the conceptual model in place. Let's talk about how you apply that in the classroom.
Yes. So, and this is, when I was reflecting on, you sent some questions through for me to consider. And it really was me kind of reflecting on the journey since I started engaging with the research. And, I saw the effect size in that first visible learning book. And I thought, wow, how powerful. But as you read more, and this is that notion of research literacy and understanding what research looks like. But when you drill down, and the research, when you actually read into some of those papers, suggests that up to 1/3 of all feedback is actually negative. So all along I was thinking, well, feedback is so powerful. How can I implement more feedback into my practice? When it really isn't about more feedback, it's actually about the right feedback at the right time. And, acknowledging that the formative element is more powerful than the summative. How do we start thinking about, well, if all feedback isn't created equal, how do we use the right feedback at the right time to leverage learning, but also be efficient? Because if you've got 25 kids in your classroom and you're delivering high-level feedback to every one of them, that is time-consuming. And we talk about feedback being throughout and being ongoing. So when I talk to teachers and school leaders about how to maximise gains through feedback practices, and the things that I guess work really well is starting off the feedback conversation before the learning even occurs. And I talk about Hattie and Timperley's feedback question of where am I going, and that notion of success criteria. Now, in the past and currently, schools still engage with the use of written success criteria to articulate, what the goals are. But when I talk about the criteria of success, I also include things like modelling, use of exemplars, both good and bad, well-written rubrics, and then unpacking with the learners before they even start engaging in that task. Well, what characteristics contribute to this high-level piece of work, and what's the difference between a high, medium, and low piece of work? That way, when they're reflecting on the work as they talk their way through it with their internal voice, they can make those judgments and those comparisons between what they can currently do and what they're shooting for. If we want to be efficient with our feedback, it is about leveraging off that now shared conceptualization of what quality looks like to support peer-to-peer conversations and self-reflection, and the teacher putting structures in place to do so. And when we talk about feedback being constant, it's also about developing the students' understanding that all of those points of information are learning opportunities. So it's about developing their language and their conceptualization of when feedback occurs. Because if they think it only happens at the end and they ignore good information, then that's an opportunity lost.
Yeah.
Some other key things that I talk about as well is the right amount of feedback at the right time and over multiple times. So giving the students a long laundry list of things that they need to do to improve. Some learners, they look at that list, they do a bit of a cost benefit.
I am guilty. I'm putting my hand up here. Guilty as charged, mate. That is, it's one of my tendencies. Here's what you could do. Here's what you're doing. Here's what you could do. Now, get to those 20 things on my list.
Yeah.
It's not that easy.
And, it's either, do I have the capacity to do so? Do I have the motivation to do so? So it is really about the 2 or 3 next things, and then another point of feedback soon after with the next 2 or 3 next things.
Right. So there's this kind of tipping point at which more information is actually detrimental to the feedback process and to the learning, ultimately to the learning process.
Very much can be, yes.
So this idea of the feedback calibration of expectations before the learning necessarily happens I think it's quite unique. That's a pretty revolutionary perspective in the teaching context, because what that means is that you can be proactive with feedback. I mean, the very word suggests that we're reactive with feedback. We're looking back in time. But what you're saying is that we can look forward in time. We can calibrate expectations and get off to a good start together. And you were talking about this idea of building a shared mental model with your students as one of your first steps. I think that's such a powerful picture of what proactive feedback can look like.
And I think back to that original point you made about, knowing your learners beforehand. So I'm going to use a simplistic example here, but just say I know that Luke has problems with his spelling. I go into this next English class with this knowledge, and when we start the learning, I not only talk about what quality looks like, but I can also flag where you might find challenges, and I give resources to go to when you're stuck. Little Luke has a bit of trouble spelling. If you have any challenges, here's your toolkit. These are the things that you do when you're stuck. And think about the amount of time that saves. If every time a student has a question, half of them could solve it themselves.
Yeah. Yep. And you've already anticipated those needs
based on knowing your learner.
Exactly. Yeah, I love it. It's wonderful. It's being proactive, and that's, I think, a new flavor of feedback that's not very commonly adopted in. Certainly not in a tertiary teaching context where we give feedback like a month after people submit their work sometimes, and it loses a lot of its power. So I'm conscious that sometimes there's organizational constraints that we succumb to. We've got our ideal version of feedback, and then there's the real world, and we're trying to talk about grappling with feedback in the wild. So just to kind of look at some of the potential friction points of giving or providing proactive feedback or having those calibration meetings with your students. You mentioned that doing it at scale can be actually quite inefficient. So what is the answer to, if you've got 25 students in your classroom and you're wanting to build a shared mental model of expectations together, you're saying that to do it at scale, you can go through this as a whole class? Is this a kind of social constructivist approach, or do you get your students talking about things in advance together in small groups, or how does that look when in an applied context?
So, for example, with exemplars, I would be sharing the rubric. You might have, depending on the nature of the kids and, their year level and all those sorts of things. That you might guide them in the writing of a rubric. What I would suggest teachers do is get a couple of exemplars. You want a high, medium, low. You might put them out and ask the students to arrange them in order of complexity and success, and then really unpack, well, what are the differences? What is the difference between this level and the next level?
Right. So they're sitting there basically doing what you would do. You as a teacher, you mark the work and you do it against a rubric, and you're actually asking your students to do that themselves to calibrate their expectations further. So, and they're in small groups doing this, or are they doing this on their own?
Well, depending on the group. I mean, but, people are, like with the VCE group, it might be sample exam questions. It might just be an opening paragraph. It doesn't have to be the whole essay. You might have different samples for different groups based on need. It's really about knowing the kids.
Yeah. Let's move on to this idea of misconceptions about feedback. I think this dovetails into that, where we Think about feedback as a reactive process, and it's a one-way street. And we've said that that whole transmission model is often thought to be from teacher to student after the fact. You've flipped that on its head and said feedback can actually be in advance, constant, dynamic and changing, and certainly not just teacher to student, but in all directions. It's multi-directional. One of the things that reminded me of, and you mentioned the Hattie and Timperley model, which is, for those of the listeners who aren't familiar, it's a 2007 paper. I think it's actually the most cited educational research paper of all time, about 14,500 citations, released in 2007. It's called The Power of Feedback. You can Google that in your own time and have a look. And the model was built around three conceptual pieces of knowing where your students are at, where they need to get to, and how to get there. There was kind of three pieces to that puzzle. Where are you at? Where are you going? And how can you get there? And others have expanded on that. And certainly there's nuances to that equation. But one of the pieces to that model and the way that Hattie and Timperley framed it was this feed forward notion. When we're talking about a student sort of getting their results in front of them, getting some of your feedback in front of them, it's not just telling them, here's where you are as a learner, and this is entirely going to sum you up with some numerical score. It's saying, here's a developmental opportunity. Here's an opportunity for you to learn, and here's a picture of what you could become. So there's this idea of pushing a lot of feedback into the future context. So can you speak to that point of how you shape your conversation so that it has maximum payoff for learning into the future with your students? This developmental feedback model?
So when I think about the next steps in more contemporary feedback practices, and certainly there are a range of researchers who are doing more work in this social constructivist mindset of what it looks like. And it's a shift around the teacher being the provider of feedback and the teacher recognising that, yes, I am the expert in the room, but there is also a peer voice and a voice of the student in themselves. And as we recognise that, I see a shift from in the teacher role in that process to setting the preconditions to develop the student capacity to respond to feedback, to provide feedback to each other, and really activating them as owners of their own learning. In the work that I did in my doctoral research, it was about asking students with a range of different feedback samples, just to give you a short overview around what they saw in the feedback and what they do with it next time around based on the feedback that the teacher provided. And what I found was that a number of students, even when given vague and non-specific feedback, would interpret what the teacher might have provided to them as advice if the feedback had been, more informative. So in study 2, there was a range of interviews with students. And with some of those students, I said to them, how are you making sense of it? The teacher hasn't said these things, but the way you've responded would be perhaps what a teacher would advise if you wanted to improve. How did you make sense of this? And in doing so, they talked about how their previous experiences allowed them the capacity to make their own judgments about what needed to be done. So, and in those interviews, they said, well, based on a prior experience, I had a conversation with the teacher, and they helped me make sense of these vague symbols. And as a result, I knew what to do to get better. They also talked about how they had a peer group and they would unpack the feedback they received together and help each other make sense of it. And they talked about how they had the confidence to make those judgments. And when I was writing my thesis, I termed this capacity as feedback capital. So essentially, some of the experiences that the students bringing into the learning experience will help them respond and action feedback either more effectively or less effectively.
Such a good term, feedback capital. It speaks to this idea that you're not working with a blank slate. The teacher isn't, and the student isn't as well.
And so what it means is that if I develop the feedback capital of the learners in my class and then they go into yours, you're not starting at day dot. You're continuing to work.
Yep. You've already got off the blocks.
So conversely, there are groups of students out there with high levels of feedback capital. They know what to do. If there are ticks, crosses, underlines, they can make sense of it. They can see that it's an error and they know what resources and strategies to go to improve. In contrast to that, though, there are also students who I interviewed who didn't know what to do.
So what you're saying is let's just say the teacher's giving very similar informational value to the student. What's determining the differences here is the actual student themselves. They have very different responses despite having a similar mechanisms for feedback from the teacher to the student.
Yes. So in one of the interviews, and it's almost a direct quote, I said to the student, you said that you wouldn't know what to do with this. It was the same feedback sample that the other student said he knew what to do based on prior experience. And this particular student said, I don't know what to do with it, so I would just throw that piece of feedback away. Right. So it really is. And I guess this is the danger when we give non-specific feedback, such as this was corrective feedback through symbols. So it was ticks, crosses, underlines, circles.
Right. Yeah.
One group of students see it, self-correct, self-analyse what the needs are, find some resources, talk to peers, have the confidence to fix it. The other group of learners with lower feedback capital are stopped in their tracks. They're demotivated, they throw the feedback away and they don't improve.
So it's actually, instead of being constructive as intended by the teacher, it's just wasting everyone's time, potentially could reinforce some negative self-concept in that student, I guess, because they don't even know what to do with the feedback. And they're probably the ones, ironically, who could benefit from it most if you can find a way to reach them. So how do you reach those students who have a low level of feedback capital and activate that sense of willingness to learn and to turn that information that is otherwise meaningless into something meaningful to them?
So to develop feedback capital, I'm going to draw on another theorist's model, Bowd and Carlos, who have written extensively about the
sustainable feedback model?
But they call it feedback literacy.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I think Carlos has done a sustainable feedback model as well, but this is obviously a different piece.
It only came out maybe 2018, this paper.
Okay.
And they talk about the development of feedback literate learners. And they talk about, to be feedback literate, to maximise the uptake of feedback, students need to appreciate feedback. So they need to understand the purpose of it. They need to manage the emotional affective feedback. So in the face of receiving something, there might be a conflict of yourself or be overly critical, understanding how to manage it. And they need to know what to do with the feedback that's provided to them. And, they posit that the development of feedback literacy in enhancing those three elements will improve the uptake and action upon receipt of feedback.
So it's just to summarize those three pieces that they emphasize. That's so appreciating feedback, managing the emotional aspect, the affective aspect, and then taking action.
Yes.
Fascinating. So let's talk about, I know this is a bit of a tangent, but I couldn't help but think of the affective element, the emotional side of feedback, which you've really, you've investigated heavily, and also it kind of ties into this idea of well-being. But in the past, I think there's been models of feedback that have ignored the emotional aspect of the students, how they receive feedback. Can you discuss that a little bit and just expand on how the emotions will affect how a student interprets feedback, and then what can be done about that so that you can use emotions to your advantage as a teacher and really leverage that?
Yes. So I guess in the past, the hypothesis has been that as the quality of feedback increases, thus the learning that occurs with the student increases. But as we know, if we provide the same piece of feedback to 5 different students, they're going to learn in different ways. Some might not learn at all. The work that I engaged in, utilising student voices and unpacking the emotional burden or response to receiving teacher feedback, what I found was, and I presented the model, the affect-effect model, as you're aware, Luke.
Yes, very good.
And what that model proposes is that student learning isn't just dictated by the information or the level of information that's provided in the feedback, but the emotional response that the student elicits in response to that feedback.
Yeah. So it's because feedback sometimes, let's face it, it can feel like a kick in the guts. And when a teacher says to you that, we can relate to this more broadly, performance evaluation. Hey, Luke, sit down. I've got some good news and bad news. And what do we all ask for first? It's bad news, right? Kick me in the guts and then build me back up as I get off the ground and try and find my feet again. So, there's these numbers that are seemingly benign on students' work, these ticks and crosses and red pen, green pen type. You've got a visceral response to a lot of those because they're so, for some students, they're so pregnant with meaning that we need to know what we're dealing with here. It's not just a trivial, symbolic gesture here. These are students put a lot of weight into these somewhat otherwise trivial feedback mechanisms. So, you're speaking about how the students are receiving their feedback. What do you do then in knowing that some students take this with incredible sort of weight, earnestness? How do you deal with that responsibility? How do you deal with that moment-to-moment conversation with your students?
So, and I guess it comes back to that original challenge that I had way back when I stopped delivering praise and I saw the effect that it had on my students. So, that lack of praise, you could see the emotional effect that it had on them. And, if we talk about that emotional feedback capital that we talked about, how do we know that learner has received 3 pieces of critical feedback already that day and they're bringing it in? They've got that low sense of self-efficacy.
So they've got a low base, yeah.
So there's a number of things that we can do. So first of all, it's about building that culture. It's about having that relationship with the students so that they know that they're celebrated as individuals in themselves, and you've got that connection, you've got that trust. And you've developed that feedback literacy piece where you're developing that sense of appreciating feedback. The purpose of feedback is to help you grow. And then you're going to help them, I guess, manage their emotions. Now, praise, when it's ineffective, is directed at the student. Things like good job, excellent job, well done. Students can see through it if they haven't done a great job, and they see it as somewhat warm and fuzzy. So what I always suggest is that if you're going to direct praise, what you want to do is you want to reinforce things that they've done well. So the first thing you're doing is you're flagging the things you want them to keep doing. This has a twofold effect. Not only does it make them feel good about the stuff they've done well, it tells them the things that they should keep doing. Yeah. And then the next step is to flag the areas that they need to improve. So there's a little bit of good, a little bit of bad. Now, the important thing is not just to stop there. After flagging where they need to improve, you also need to give them resources to support that improvement. Example, often a student will know that they don't know how to spell a word because they take time on it. They think about it. What's that word? I know it's not right. They didn't misspell it because they know what the strategy is. They misspelled it because they don't have the strategy. Right. So it's about flagging things that are done well, flagging things that need improvement, and then giving resources to support that improvement.
Love that. What fascinates me there is that from a student's perspective, so often we assume this deficit-based model where we point out what they did wrong will be most useful to them. What you're saying is that that's a very incomplete picture of feedback from the student's perspective. They're going to want to know what they're doing right as well. So a strengths-based model as well as deficits-based. And you bring those things together, that's still not enough, just strengths and weaknesses. What you're saying is you've actually got to talk about the future. And this kind of dovetails back into what I was saying earlier with the developmental approach to feedback, where it's not just a snapshot of here's where you're at, but it's feed forward. It says, here's where we need to go in the future. And I'm going to show you how to get there. And you're not just saying, I'm going to show you how to get there in an abstract sense. You're actually saying, here's some resources. And pragmatically, these are the steps you're going to take. And these are the things you're going to use to get there. So that when they do encounter those same challenges, those learning challenges in the future, they can empower themselves with the ability to overcome that. So you're building internal resources in your students. So it's a very powerful model. That's it's kind of a few levels up to the traditional, here's your score out of 100%. Be on your way.
Yeah, and I think, another thing I talk to teachers about is, people might say, well, how are we going to give strategies to 25 different kids? But if we're talking about developing feedback capital, you do it a couple of times and you shouldn't have to do it anymore.
It's
so
an investment.
How do you facilitate that in the short term? I do teach one class. I teach a psychology class. So often after getting a report, I will talk rather than, they will get their individual feedback, but I will address common errors and things that have happened. You had trouble with a hypothesis, you had trouble identifying an independent variable and a dependent variable, address it as a group. The other thing that is really useful in developing that capacity to think about, well, what do I do to improve? Have a little reflection. Once they get their results, have them reflect on the things they've done well, the things that they need to do to get better, and then what resources they will access to make those improvements. And that's a really effective way of getting them to think more deeply and respond to that more constructive feedback that's provided.
Yeah, and when you put the breadcrumbs in the right direction for your entire cohort, your entire classroom, they can reinforce and signal to one another, which direction to go. So it's not just relying on individuals doing the right things unto themselves. These students are signaling to one another, here's how we can make sense of this feedback and respond collectively. So you can have peer-to-peer teaching in that sense. There's a good opportunity there to scale your feedback approach. Let's swing things a little bit in the direction that is often uncomfortable for teachers, which is, we've talked a lot about giving students feedback, but there's also this uncomfortable topic of students giving feedback to teachers on their performance. How do you feel about that direction of feedback? And, how's that best achieved? How can we cultivate a classroom where that is a productive experience for everyone?
Yes, and it's certainly powerful. Again, to use the evidence as a starting point, formative evaluation and visible learning has an effect size of 0.9. So if you think of how far above that hinge point of an average year's growth that is, it's certainly significant.
Yep.
And one of the key messages that Hattie certainly sold following that was that feedback was more powerful going from the student to the teacher. So there's certainly powerful ideas in which to reflect on, but how does that look in practice? When you're talking about teachers receiving feedback from students, there are often a lot of emotional considerations to take into account.
You're giving me flashbacks, mate, of one of my student evaluations said, I look and sound and act like a used car salesman. So perhaps I've missed the career opportunity I was called for. So that didn't go down too well. I'll tell you, there was an emotional reaction there on my part where I certainly didn't want to read the next student's feedback on my student evaluations of learning and teaching. So unfortunately, there was a lot better feedback after that. But yeah, there's definitely an emotional aspect that I think hinders the transformation of that information into something powerful and productive.
Well, I think, and this is unhelpful for you, but the important thing is to make sure you're asking the right questions. Like I said earlier, my master's research was in gathering student feedback to inform teacher professional growth. When we asked those questions, we asked things like, what does your teacher do that helps you learn? And when we talked about what the challenges were, we removed the teacher from it. So it was, what are the things that hinder your learning? And the important thing about that is because often the challenges that a student experiences in the classroom have nothing to do with the teacher. And based on, I can only speak to the findings of that master's research, but the teachers in that study found it a really positive, affirming experience in the sense that it reinforced things that were really working for them. So the students said things like, when responding to what things does the teacher do to help you learn, they said things like, sits with me just one-on-one and helps me talk through my problems, those sorts of things. When we talked about the things that are challenging for the student in a classroom, it was very rarely about the teacher, other than something like, sometimes I'd like things repeated because I have trouble hearing. But often it was things like about social dynamics in the classroom. Often it was things about issues the student were having at home that might be hindering their attention, for example. So it really is about asking the right questions.
Yeah. All right, so I think we've made it through most of the big items that I wanted to cover. This next section's just to finish on a strong note. So it's called Big Questions, Little Answers. And so I'll read the prompt of the question, and if you could finish it with a nice pithy response, then we're on fire, mate. We're doing well. All right, so big questions, little answers. First question is, the purpose of education is?
The purpose of education is to prepare students for a happy and productive life.
Beautiful. Can't argue with that.
Yeah.
The most important change that teachers can make to improve their teaching is?
So through the feedback lens, given that that's the theme of the podcast, I think it's making the learner more active in the feedback process.
Yeah, instead of just from that transmission model, teacher to student. Yeah. Okay, the biggest strength of our teaching profession is?
Teachers' passion and commitment to positive change.
Yeah, I can't disagree with that. Teachers, when you ask them why did they sign up for the job, they all want to make a difference. They all want to make this world a better place, and education is the chosen vehicle to do it. So we can't fault them for that.
And I think in the research space, if you can tap into that passion and commitment and address a gap for them so they can be more successful, that's how you capture their engagement.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, they're not short on their motivation to make that difference, but I think we've got to do a better job as researchers to harness that and understand that. Okay, the most important difference a teacher can make on the lives of their students is...
to listen. Pretty simple.
I like it.
Well, you think about it, I mean, we have all manner of students with different needs and home lives and backgrounds coming into our schools. For the student with a really stable home life, not going to hurt them to have a teacher that listens to them. You know, for some other kids, they might really lack an advocate. So you never know what impact listening is going to have.
Yeah, and it ties into what you were saying earlier about feedback being a two-way street as well, and having the power to have a voice in your classroom, and a teacher who listens to their students catalyzes that. Okay, next question. The most important work being done in the field of educational research is...
So for little answers, this is my longest one, but I think the most important work being done is the consideration of competencies that will prepare students for the future. So as we know, the needs of what these young people, the skills, the capabilities, the knowledge is relatively unknown. So how can we prepare them for a future where they're going to have to deal with some significant challenges? You know, Fullen's 6 C's are a starting point in citizenship, collaboration, critical thinking, creativity, communication, and character. And then as an extension to that, how do we as schools evidence these?
Right. Yeah, well, that's another podcast there, mate. We'll have to get you back for that one. That's exciting. Okay, if we keep doing blank, the education sector will be doomed.
If we keep doing things the same way, the education sector will be doomed. Yeah, it's a relatively traditional craft, even, you know, despite some of the differences. But I think we need to be constantly thinking about what the needs are of our learners and what the world needs. So we just need to be constantly evolving, reflecting, thinking, what's next.
And of course, part of your job title, innovating. Okay, so the flip side of that, if we keep doing blank, the education sector will be a huge success.
If we keep building both academic capacities and social, emotional wellbeing literacy, the education sector will be a huge success.
Yeah. So you're talking about the whole person, not just the academics, but this is where that caring piece of the puzzle comes into play. Yeah, especially post-COVID, right? Super relevant. If I had $1 billion to spend on improving the education sector, I would spend it on...
I would spend it on developing student wellbeing and, in brackets, add to that staff wellbeing.
Those two are tightly interconnected. Happy students without happy teachers, that doesn't happen often. Yeah, that's good. That's good. Again, that could be another podcast for another time. I want to hear how you wrestle with that. Okay, the most important habit a graduate teacher can learn is?
I think the most important capacity to have is self-reflection. And I say that professionally and personally. Professionally, you need to be able to reflect on your practice, think about what's working, how do I know, what do I need to do differently, the capacity to be really self-aware. And personally, because teaching is challenging at times, there are times when you deal with learners who have really challenging lives. So you really need to think about, well, where's my well of energy? You know, where do I find my flow? How do I manage a professional life that can be quite taxing whilst not burning out?
Yeah. And you definitely have to know yourself well to know where your limits are, where you get your passion from, and all of those important pieces to that puzzle. Love it. So the most meaningful change a school or educational leader can make to improve the learning outcomes and or the wellbeing outcomes of their students is?
So this is a bit of another longer one. So I think the most meaningful thing, if they want to engage in this research translation piece, it's to dedicate time and resources to developing teachers with an eye for evidence. Making sure that they're able to engage collaboratively using an inquiry-based approach to improving their practice. All of the other noise needs to be turned down. Okay,
final question. The most significant influence a person has had on my career is?
From a career perspective, at the moment, I would probably say John Hattie, who sent me that email after reading my master's thesis and said, I think this student voice piece on feedback has a bit more to say.
So we saw something in you that you hadn't seen in yourself at that time, and look where you are now.
I'd been a teacher for 12 or 15 years, and I thought I'll try this Masters of School Leadership. It's going to be good professional growth. Found it really rewarding. Thought, well, that's that. John wasn't my supervisor for that, but I got an email from him saying he wanted to have a meeting, and he encouraged me to go down the path of further exploring the student voice piece in relation to the student feedback experience. And, it's been a really rewarding journey. So I thank him for that.
Luke, it's been wonderful to chat with you. I think it's piqued my interest in a whole lot more. So I feel like we've just touched the tip of the iceberg there. I hope we can have you back for another podcast. I hope I haven't scared you off too much. And I'm sure that the listeners are going to find this extremely informative for their practice. So thanks again, Luke. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, Luke.
I hope you enjoyed our discussion with Dr. Luke Mandouit as much as I did. Upon reflecting on our conversation, there were some key points that really stood out to me. The first was about the proactive, multi-channel, dynamic and constant aspect of feedback. The second was about building shared mental models of success and failure with students. The third was about the importance of getting feedback on the effectiveness of your own feedback. And the fourth was about the idea of feedback capital and the view that feedback should not just be evaluated on the basis of its immediate impact, but also seen as an investment in the student's future capacity to both receive and utilise feedback effectively. And the final point that stood out to me is the importance of emotions in feedback. So let me briefly summarise each of these points in turn. Now, the first point that Luke made is that feedback is proactive, not just reactive. It's multi-channel, it's dynamic and constant. It's not just a reactive process or this one-way transmission model between teacher and student, perhaps as the old behaviourist models of teaching would suggest. It's also about students coming to understand that all of the points of information that they receive or encounter in the classroom can be used as learning opportunities. So a teacher's language and framing of feedback and various sources of information is a very powerful catalyst for developing the student's conceptualization of feedback, and in turn, stimulating a kind of insatiable appetite for learning. The second point that really struck me was that classroom teachers would benefit from building a shared mental model of what success and failure look like, and that this can and should be done proactively and at scale with the entire classroom. This approach is like readying the feedback soil so that subsequent seeds of feedback will grow and help the student flourish. Examples of high, medium and low quality work can be discussed as students and teachers come to share in a mental model of what both success and failure look like, of how to proactively manage strategies for common errors and mistakes, and to calibrate expectations together about what students can expect in terms of quality of work relative to grades and outcomes. And there are other practical tips for making this process more efficient for time-poor teachers, such as focusing on one criteria at a time in the rubric, looking at a single paragraph or example of writing that's only a bite-sized piece, or perhaps building a discussion around one of many potential solutions to a complex problem. Another point Luke raised was that effective feedback often involves asking students the right questions. These may include exploratory discussions about how students can turn feedback into concrete steps towards improving their learning. In short, teachers need to ask questions that prompt students to reflect on the key elements of feedback in a way that can be readily applied to their own learning. Luke also mentioned that effective teachers will often seek out feedback from their students through surveys and questionnaires that ask their students how they can improve their teaching practices. While this can be helpful, Luke did advise that such practices are more effective when they involve separating the evaluative from the formative aspects of feedback, so that the questions are tilted toward how the teacher can better support the learner, rather than about what the student does or does not like about the teacher per se. Another important point was that the student's experience will help them interpret, make sense of, respond to and act upon various forms of feedback. Luke referred to this as feedback capital. The higher the feedback capital, the more a student can flourish even in the presence of low quality or poor feedback. Alternatively, the lower the feedback capital of a student, the more likely they are to miss the instructional value of the feedback, even when it's delivered in a seemingly effective manner. Luke spoke of Carlos and colleagues' model about feedback, and this model has parallels to his own notion of feedback capital. However, they refer to it as feedback literacy, where students can build their capacity to meaningfully apply feedback based on 3 key things. The first of those was the need to appreciate feedback as a growth piece. The second was that the students and teachers need to manage the emotional or affective elements of feedback. And the third is that students know how to utilize the feedback in their future learning, right? So it's got an application piece to it. Doing those 3 things, according to the Carlos model, will help students improve their uptake and action of feedback in the future. So it grows their feedback capital and their feedback literacy. The final point involves the importance of emotions in feedback. Luke spoke of his affect-effect model. That's affect with an A and effect with an E. This model speaks to the idea that effective student learning isn't just determined purely by cognitive mechanisms or the level of information exchanged during discourse, but it also highlights the emotive and affective elements as enormously influential in the entire feedback process. To help harness this dimension of feedback, we've got to ensure that all feedback is situated within the broader context of a classroom culture in which every student knows that the purpose of feedback is to help them grow, that you care for them, you want what's best for them, that you're there to support their learning. If these elements are missing, then your feedback is much more likely to go awry or to be misinterpreted through a hypervigilant lens. In the context of that nourishing feedback culture, you can offer sincere feedback that reinforces what students are doing well without being considered inauthentic or phony. And that makes clear to the student what they need to keep doing moving forward. And that can be balanced by critical feedback that's targeted toward what the students need to do to improve. And that can be offered in a disarming way by encouraging the student to reflect on these things themselves. For example, Luke suggested asking the student to reflect on what they've done well and the things they've done poorly or could improve on for next time with their learning. And finally, once the student knows what they need to do to improve, you've got to empower them with the resources to follow through on this. There's no use providing wonderful feedback to students if they're sent up the creek without a paddle. We've got to get them the resources they need to build a bridge between where they're at and where they need to go with their learning. Now that's about all we have time for in today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to know more about the release of upcoming content or support this program, I'll include links in the show notes. Until next time, may you continue to learn powerfully.